Okay. Well, thank you everyone for attending an Essex seminar. My name is Kazi Medley. I am going to be the seminar moderator today. So today we have Andrew Feldman, who is Essex and also NASA, and Ralph is going to give us a quick intro.
Yeah. Thanks, Kazi. Yeah, I'd just like to introduce Andrew Feldman, who associate research scientist here at Essex. I guess you've been here like 4 years, 2023. Okay. Works over at Goddard. And let's see, your background. You got your um, undergraduate degrees at Drexel, and then you got your PhD at MIT, civil engineering. Andrew does a lot of interesting work with vegetation and rainfall. You also were a postdoc at Goddard at some point in your career, or before you joined Essex. And I'm just going to turn it over to you. So welcome. All right.
Yeah, thanks all for having me. It's nice to get over here to see everyone, and I've spoken to a lot of you over email, so it's nice to see a lot of you in person. And thanks for coming after break too. I know a lot of you are probably a little bit foggy, but hopefully this gets you excited about science again coming back on Monday. So yeah, I'm Andrew. I associate research scientist here, and I'm an Essex person, but I sit most of my time at the Biospheric Sciences Lab at Goddard. I'm going to just point to the word. So I'm talking today about observing large-scale vegetation response to rainfall variability, and I'll describe what I mean by that. It sounds pretty broad, but I'll just point to observing large-scale. This is going to be a satellite remote sensing talk, right? So I'll be talking mostly about work with satellite. I'm a satellite remote sensing person, and I want to integrate this with models, and we're actually moving that direction. So I'll give just a quick background about me real quick, and Ralph kind of said this, so I won't spend too much time here, but I'm a civil engineer. In fact, I'm kind of a urban hydrologist to start, hydraulics engineering, so that's kind of where I got my start in science. And I started at Drexel University and worked for a time at the Philadelphia Water Department, which was a very fun time. And then I ended up at MIT's civil engineering department, which actually was a little bit more sciencey. It was kind of more on the engineering science side. And so I got to do satellite remote sensing with Dara Antakabi, who's the SMAP science team lead. So it was very fun to kind of learn how soil moisture data was actually retrieved from satellites. I actually helped write an algorithm to do this, and then use the data and what applications you can do with large scale soil moisture measurements. And from that, I then applied that and went to Goddard to work at the Biospheric Sciences Lab as an NPP fellow with Ben Poulter. So I got to apply this work to understand the carbon cycle, how water and the carbon cycles are coupled, and how water carbon energy cycles are coupled, and how vegetation plays a role in the Earth system. So it's a very big focus of my work there. And now I'm at Essex, and I've had a range of projects. I was a PI for the ECOSTRESS science team for a while, and that project's ending this year. And I just have a new grant with the eco-hydrology program. So really kind of continuing a lot of this work I've been doing for my fellowship. I was also, if you heard about ARID, I was a co-lead with the USGS PI to do the next, I don't know if anybody has heard of the Above field campaign in the Arctic. We were proposing a dry land field campaign next, and made it pretty far. In fact, we're tentatively selected to go forward with a dry land field campaign, but of course funding has been challenging, and we're waiting for program managers to give us the word. So pointing to my main question that I've been working on all these years is and kind of showed you that story of where this is the thing I've been after is how do Earth's land surfaces respond to rainfall variability and drought? Rainfall variability, I'll describe that a bit, but my argument here is that we miss thinking about this. We think about how much water is available, how much light is available, how much nutrients are available, how much humidity there is, but we kind of miss thinking about the variations of these factors, and this actually turns out to be quite important. And it really, to answer that question, we have to answer this question, which is a little bit more technical, but it's asking what does this rainfall variability, what role does this rainfall variability play in the interactions between the water, carbon, and energy cycles? And so water, carbon, energy cycles are all linked at the land surface. And vegetation is a very, very dominant role in how water, carbon, and energy cycles are linked. In fact, it happens at the leaf surface. So it's just photosynthesis and such. Water being converted into carbon, and energy interacting with these processes as well. So that's the main question I'm after there. And so in order to answer these questions, vegetation, unfortunately, we have to really do a deep dive and understand vegetation. And so really the question turns into, how is vegetation responding to rainfall variability, to answer this question? So a little bit more background about why we're thinking about vegetation. And, some of you might, I'm kind of talking to a crowd here that might be sympathetic to this idea, but if you're not familiar, vegetation is a huge, huge role in the Earth system. If you're trying to model how the boundary layer works and you put a bunch of, if the atmosphere is interacting with the surface and you put a bunch of shapes on the surface, which is vegetation, it turns out that affects aerodynamics and turbulence quite a bit. It's a very big, creates friction at the surface. So just the structure of vegetation has an influence. Transpiration has an influence. Water coming out of the canopy, interception, that can create convection. It can fuel convection. And then, of course, you're changing the radiation balance, albedo. So vegetation presence on the surface hugely impacts how the atmosphere influences the surface. If you're a land surface model and you're not thinking about vegetation, you're probably not doing a very good job, unfortunately, because it's a huge part of the process. And then if you're thinking about the carbon cycle, well, the vegetation is also a huge role in the carbon cycle as well. It's substantially, if we're pumping CO2 into the atmosphere on the top axis there, that CO2 is going into different components of the Earth system. This line here is ocean. It's going to the ocean, and it's also going into the land. And whatever's not going to the land is going back into the atmosphere. And that land sink, heavily driven by vegetation as well. So just pointing out, we need to really, really, really understand how vegetation is functioning, and it's not an easy thing to understand. It's got kind of a mind of its own. And another way to think about this too, if you think about evapotranspiration being bare soil evaporation coming from the surface, transpiration, interception. Transpiration is a huge part of ET, of evaporation. So so it's basically more than 50%. It's kind of disputed how much of transpiration is the total amount of evapotranspiration, but it's above 50%. That's kind of what all the numbers agree. So it's transpiration, and vegetation dominates the water flux from the land surface. So, like I said, so I hope I motivated very clearly for you why we need to understand vegetation functioning, and we're going to start thinking about variability here. But before we do that, how well do we know vegetation limitations? Well, so this figure was published by Ramakrishnan Amani and et al. In Science in 2003, and there's been variations of this. I would say for years, for decades now, we have a first-order understanding of what drives vegetation. So I'm not going to present something new to you about, I found a new limiting sink or limiting factor with vegetation. We kind of have a good idea. We know in the tropics, radiation is a limiting factor. We know in Australia, wet, drier locations, water is the main limiting factor. Higher latitudes, radiation and temperature are going to be limiting factors. So we have that idea. We know kind of to a first order which factors are going to be limiting vegetation. And then if we go to a location and we try to understand temporally, can we predict what's happening temporally to vegetation, evaporation at the land surface and such? We can look to, hydrologists love these plots, and I'm guilty of making these plots all the time of evaporation versus soil moisture, and then gross primary productivity, for our purposes here, photosynthesis, vegetation activity versus soil moisture as well. And you get these kind of nice curves, basically these monotonic, nonlinear relationships that describe a lot about, at a location, how evaporation is varying in time and how gross primary productivity is varying in time. And it can be summarized like this, that under low soil moisture conditions at a location, if you go outside and it gets dry, evaporation and vegetation productivity is going to be limited by moisture. But then we move to a wetter side of this. We go maybe more above a critical threshold, we like to call it, but really at a wetter wetter side of the spectrum, maybe in the spring, it rains a lot, we become energy limited. So energy limited, aerodynamically limited. So again, at a location, we have some idea temporally how to predict vegetation functioning. And again, this has kind of been solved already. This is the Boudico function. If you're a hydrologist, this is a kind of familiar term that we know how moisture, radiation, aerodynamics interact to drive evaporation and kind of carbon fluxes from the surface. But in practice, it all kind of falls apart. So now we actually go out and we grab data. And so this is a dry land location. So this is by Anna Ukola et al., they're Australian scientists, they put together this nice figure that kind of is this counter argument that even in a dry location where it's water limited, let's grab the mean amount of precipitation in a year and also how much vegetation productivity or the amount of vegetation in a year. And we should get a very, very nice tight linear curve. We should get 1-to-1 curve. But actually, there's a ton of spread. So now all of a sudden, our R squared, spatially is 0.66, but then temporally at one location, it's less than 26% of the variability is explained by mean annual precipitation. So this is a dry location. This is Australia. We pour more buckets of water on the surface, and we don't strictly get, in every case, more vegetation fractional cover, more leaf area index, more carbon uptake. So what's going on? So even where it's dry, more rainfall does not strictly increase photosynthesis and growth. So what's going on? And this shows up also. You might say, oh, who cares? We don't, let's just draw a line through that and predict things. Who cares about the variability? Well, it turns out that variability shows up in that figure I just plotted a couple slides ago. If you look at the carbon going into, you pump emissions in the atmosphere, we have carbon going into the ocean, which has a fairly stable idea of what's going into the ocean. But then the land sink is all over the place. How much carbon is actually going to land? We get these very, very, very choppy lines, and it's pretty unpredictable, actually. We don't predict that very well. If you go to the best terrestrial biosphere models, they do not do a very good job modeling the observations of all these little choppy lines here, of all of the carbon going into the land sink.
So it's average leaf area index, or where do you get the choppiness from?
That's annually averaged CO2 flux going to the land surface. So this is a mixture of. You can at flux towers, and you can scale. There's different. So there's different ways to get at this through observations. You can do the you can do the bottom up approach, which is the trendy models, right? And then you can do top down approaches, which are using carbon observations and running it through an inversion model and getting a CO2 flux. But the fact is, if you kind of use one of these models to try to actually model the choppiness there, it doesn't do very well, basically. So that's the general point. We can pick up some of the variability, but it's not very good. It's not a predictable thing. So we think about CO2 fertilization, and we think about the mean changes of photosynthesis over years. But to predict the Earth system, we really need to understand the interannual variability. So another point, we need to think about the variability here to some degree to really predict the overall ecosystem behavior. So my argument here is that there are other candidate sources of what's driving vegetation variability that need to be considered. And the two that I spent a lot of time looking at, I'm not saying that these are going to solve all of our problems, but I figured we need to take a deeper look. So I did a deep dive for several years looking at the left, the daily scale variability, and I'll talk a little bit about one project, a summary of several projects actually that looks at this daily rainfall variability. And then we'll also think about drought variability. And so just thinking about what is daily scale rainfall variability, I'm defining this as, the timescales of rainfall pulses and dry down periods. It rains in those blue blocks on the left. That's a kind of a rain pulse. So it matters how intense the storm is and how much soil moisture increases after that rainfall. And then how long that dry spell is between the next storm, how arid the system becomes. And the question there is, do shifts in daily rainfall variability influence this annual timescale photosynthesis that we were looking at before? If I have a bucket of water and I have a houseplant, do I dump it all in the houseplant on Sunday, or do I give it a third Monday, Wednesday, Friday? That's essentially the question we're asking here. And on the right, then we have seasonal scale variability, drought. Which land surfaces respond the most to drought? It turns out it's not a trivial question. We might have an idea that a place might be more water limited, but it might be more adapted to drought as well. So it's actually a very complex question to ask. Which land surfaces, evapotranspiration and vegetation functioning respond the most to drought is not an easy question. And so these are things I've been looking at over the years, and I'm still looking at these. And I'll give you, two brief looks at both of these questions and some papers we've published looking at these. And I'll also a final piece of motivation. Rainfall variability is increasing. Any rainfall people in the room? Any precipitation folks in the room? Okay, great. So, if you read the original Held and Soden kind of wet gets wetter papers, and it turns out that it's a very variable how moisture is changing over the globe on average. But one of the key features we're seeing is that rainfall variability is increasing almost everywhere. So for daily time scales, this means rainfall pulses, all those yellow blocks there are where CMIP models are showing that we're seeing less frequent rainfall, so less frequent drizzle events, less frequent wet days. But when it's raining, we're getting more intense storms. So we're not necessarily getting more rainfall. It's just that it's getting repackaged basically into these kind of bigger, you can think of it simply from shifting from drizzle events to more, less frequent thunderstorms, basically. So you can think of it that way. And then, of course, drought variability, pretty much everywhere we're seeing more intense and extensive drought. So subseasonal rainfall totals, if we have a drought anomaly, it's larger, typically, if we see it. So what methods will I be using? I'm actually staying simple here and using kind of the main remotely sensed vegetation indices that folks have been using for quite some time. It's not really adding much new to the table here, and maybe that's a little bit in the simplicity of these studies. We're not adding any kind of new tools that haven't been used before. MODIS, NDVI, vegetation greenness, OCO2 and GOM2, these satellites that look at solar-induced fluorescence, is a little bit closer look at photosynthesis than greenness does. But these are kind of metrics that look at the upper canopy vegetation functioning, greenness, how much photosynthesis functioning is going on at a pixel scale of, say, a couple kilometers. And then, of course, surface soil moisture, we'll take a look at using that to detect pulses and moisture anomalies at the soil surface. I'd say a little bit newer, we'll take a closer look at evaporation measurements from really evaporation retrievals from ECOSTRESS, which is a 70-meter resolution, 70 meter by 70 meter resolution. So basically about the size of this building and the parking lot, that scale to look at how much ET evapotranspiration is varying in space and how much it's responding to drought. I'll argue we're not running to models, we're not running to trendy models and the dynamic vegetation models to look at these problems because they struggle with variability. If you look through the literature, they do very well predicting seasonal cycles and the mean for the most part. But when it comes to daily scale pulses and drought variability, they start to struggle there. So this is why we're using observations eventually as a benchmark for these models. Okay, so looking at the first question, breaking this down a little bit to you. So do shifts in daily rainfall variability influence annual timescale vegetation functioning? You can think of it like this as just a schematic plot as a given month having 5 rainfall events and soil moisture pulsing up and then declining over a couple days until the next event. And then a different month or the kind of climate that we're changing into, we're having more intense, less frequent rainfall. Now we have 3 rainfall events, but they're larger. So we have a bigger rainfall event, soil moisture goes up more, but now we have a longer time scale between the events. So that means that there's more water being added to the surface, but also a longer aridity period. So there's the competing effects there. So does vegetation like that more? Again, do I dump all my water on my plant on Sunday and then do it again next Sunday? Or do I dump water Monday, Wednesday, Friday, just a little bit? How should I water my plant? Does annual photosynthesis go down, not change or gain functioning when we think of this? That's essentially what that question's asking. So, the math behind this question then turns out to be looking something like this conceptually. This is really just conceptual. So, if there is a y-intercept, there is an error term and such built in. There's a bunch of things, but just conceptually think about this project, we tried to model in a given pixel. We have, changes in NDVI year to year. That's what we're trying to predict. We know that annual total amounts of rainfall will have some predictive ability. So that's going to be a term that's always in this equation of how much rainfall is occurring in a year. And then there's other factors you can put in, light availability, so radiation, net radiation at the surface, vapor pressure deficit, or basically humidity and air temperature. And then our question here is, if we add this other term here to the end, whether rainfall events effectively occur more frequently or more intensely on average over a year, does this have some bearing on, explaining NDVI or greenness or photosynthetic changes year to year? That's the question. So the answer to this question, and I'm sorry, but this happens when I convert from PC to, or sorry, Mac to PC, but don't worry too much. I'll describe these figures. Effectively, what these figures are here are that slope value, the sensitivities of these two terms here. So that's what these two figures are. So this was published in Nature last year. What we showed, the bottom left there is just a sandy check. So the bottom left is how much does a total amount of annual precipitation influence NDVI or photosynthesis year to year? It's a sanity check. So all those blue values there, you see those blue values in, if you squint, you can see that they're in the drier locations, Western US, Australia, Sahel in Africa, Southern Africa. So in drier locations, it rains more, NDVI tends to go up, SIF tends to go up. This figure down here, surprisingly, I was expecting at least that this was not going to be very pixelated. We'd see maybe a couple pixels here and there, that daily rainfall variability wasn't going to matter too much. It turns out that we had significant values, almost the same locations throughout as the total amount of rainfall. And we ran this regression in many different ways, taking out different variables, trying different satellites, trying different data sets. And this result kept happening. And what it said was that, conducting this empirical study with many different satellites on average, we found a substantial impact of daily rainfall variability on NDVI and vegetation functioning year to year. So if you shifted how many wet days occurred in a year or how strong the rain events occurred in a year, that had a big bearing on vegetation functioning, more than we expected. So I'll give you an example here to how to think about this. So this is 2 years in an example pixel in a grassland in Botswana. So this is a dry grassland. It receives about 350 millimeters per year. And I'm actually isolating 2 different years. In 2005 in the red line and 2016 in the black line, they received the same amount of rainfall, 340 millimeters of rain in both of those years. But how the rain occurred was very different in both of those years. You had very similar net radiation, very similar humidity, but you had very different rainfall regimes. In the red line in 2005, there were more drizzle events. There were 70 rainfall events. But in the black line, there were 55 rainfall events, except that those rainfall events were larger. And you can see that in the hydrograph on the top there. For the black, in 2016, that 2016 year had a lot more big thunderstorm events. But there weren't many drizzle events. So they had the same rainfall over the year, but very different ways in which it rained. And NDVI was 20% higher in 2016. So it means that the year that had fewer but larger rainfall events, NDVI liked that more than a year that had more drizzle events. So that's a kind of conceptual example to help you think about this. And I'm sorry, I should have known we were converting to a PC, but this figure is very simply showing that I was expecting values of 0 here. This is normalizing the effect of daily rainfall variability on vegetation functioning. I was expecting all of these guys to be down here at 0, meaning that daily rainfall variability didn't really matter that much. The fact that it's close to 1 means that the sensitivity of vegetation to the total amount of rainfall is almost the same as the vegetation sensitivity as to the daily rainfall amount. You can read that sentence there. Vegetation sensitivity to daily rainfall variability is almost as large as vegetation sensitivity to annual rainfall totals, which was shocking to me. And I still almost don't believe it. I would have been happy, and I'm sure the Nature editor would have been happy if these values were even still down at 50% down here. We were expecting 0 or 0.1 or something. So this just shows that daily rainfall variability, it matters how you dump water on your house plant as much as how much I'm dumping on my house plant. If I dump it all on Sunday versus a little bit Monday, Wednesday, Friday, that actually matters quite a bit. Almost as much as, I should increase how much is in the bucket of water that I put in there. So just daily rainfall variability matters. And okay, then you can ask, do the patterns make any sense here? Do the spatial patterns make any sense? And they did. We found that fewer larger rainfall events tended to increase functioning in dry ecosystems, and they decreased functioning in wetter ecosystems. So it wasn't a uniform that fewer but larger rainfall events would always increase vegetation functioning or always decrease it. It turns out that it matters which type of ecosystems you're in. And to our first order, it splits up from dry to wet ecosystems. Like, more humid locations, you go to the tropics, they tend to not like having longer dry spells. Basically, they don't benefit as much from the large rainfall events. And this can be explained. One of the main mechanisms, after doing quite a bit of work, we came to this being a major explanatory factor of this behavior that we saw, that basically, if you're in a drier location, it comes down to how photosynthesis varies with soil moisture. Having this nonlinear relationship that I showed you in the beginning, that Booty cofunction, is a major explanatory factor here. And if you're in a dry location and we're getting more intense rainfall but less frequent rainfall, that larger rainfall pulse matters a lot to that vegetation. It's going to say, hey, I'm going to use this, and we're going to do a lot of photosynthesis with this bigger rainfall event. Give me a thunderstorm. And a longer dry spell, they're adapted to that. They're okay with having longer dry periods. Whereas in a more energy limited place like Maryland, a larger rainfall pulse doesn't tend to help vegetation as much as it would in a drier ecosystem. But the longer dry spell has longer aridity periods. In fact, if you looked at the 2024 bulletin for Maryland, we had this exact pattern happen. We had fewer but larger rainfall events. If you remember last summer, we had a lot of really big rainfall events, and then 2 weeks would go by, and then a big rainfall event, and 2 weeks would go by. And my vegetation actually died. All my perennials died over that summer, which kind of, while I was working on this, I saw that, and it kind of went back to my figure in this paper. It's like, that's maybe what could have been happening there. Okay, so did that make sense compared to other studies out there? So we did a meta-analysis and wrote this review paper that other studies also found this behavior as well, that dry locations, they increase plant functioning under fewer larger rainfall events. And wet locations, it switched to negative plant responses to these fewer but larger rainfall events. So again, daily rainfall variability, there's been some tests at field studies. There are not many out there, but at least the ones that we could find verified what we saw in the satellite data. So this wasn't completely off the wall results that we got from the satellite data. In fact, it gave us a sanity check looking back at some of the field studies that were out there. And the field studies also showed as well that if you look at the numbers, and we did a meta-analysis with the field studies that we saw, and they also found that if you held the total amount of rainfall constant, but you did more, kind of bunch of drizzle events versus kind of dumping water once every other week. If you do that, you can change vegetation functioning by 10 to 30% over a year, basically. You can really shift how much vegetation functioning is occurring, negative in more wetter environments and positive typically in drier environments. So this matters. Daily rainfall variability matters. I'm not going to walk through the whole slide, but just showing that we walked through in this meta-analysis all the different types of mechanisms we thought about. If you have a larger rainfall event, what does that do to all these different hydrologic processes? And if you have a longer dry spell, what does that also do to a lot of hydrologic and plant processes? So we thought a lot about this. And again, this S-shaped curve, photosynthesis versus soil moisture, was a major factor that drives the behavior we saw in the satellite data and why we saw negative versus positive responses to a shifted, more intensified rainfall. So the answer to this question then, do shifts in daily rainfall variability influence annual timescale vegetation functioning? Our answer is yes, that both dry and wet climatologically locations respond to daily rainfall variability, and that it is, in fact, probably a missing factor in a lot of different contexts when we're trying to predict how much seasonally or annually, how much vegetation functioning there is in a location. This factor probably matters a lot. And I'm actually collaborating with somebody now who's putting their Y variable over there is groundwater. They're looking at how much does groundwater change based on a lot of different variables. And it turns out that daily rainfall variability matters a lot because groundwater cares about how intense the rainfall is. Can we get water to recharge? It doesn't really matter if you're just how much water did it occur in the year. They want to know how many big wet days there were to actually get water deeper into the soil. So this is a factor probably in a lot of different contexts, but definitely for vegetation, we think. We're a little surprised by this third bullet here. I almost still don't trust it, but that's what the regression showed, that daily rainfall variability appears almost similar in magnitude as effects of annual rainfall amounts. I think that's kind of remarkable that we found that. Okay, so the next question then is about drought And this is a little bit of a short, and this is actually the study we're working on now. This is unpublished, by the way, so take what I say with a grain of salt. We're still writing these papers now, but we're coming to the end of our grant. But the question really comes down to which land surfaces respond the most to subseasonal scale drought. And you could have many hypotheses. You can ask, anybody. You could ask your parents. I've done that. Do you think a plant in Arizona is going to do better under the same drought as a plant in my backyard in Maryland? And it turns out ecologists have their own hypotheses about this because they get such different results. So they've actually, Alan Knapp and Mendy Smith at Colorado State wrote a nice paper last year summarizing a lot of these different results. Showing that, okay, there's a stress adaptation hypothesis that at a place that's wetter, they're not going to, those plants are not going to do as well in Maryland, for instance, wetter location under a drought. They're not going to do as well because they're not stress adapted, whereas plants in Arizona are stress adapted. So the hypothesis there, the stress adaptation hypothesis says that plants in Maryland will do worse under a drought than plants in Arizona. The opposite hypothesis is the resource limitation hypothesis that if you go to Arizona at a drier location, those plants are already drought sensitive. They're already water sensitive, so they should respond more to drought. And that, plants in water, plants in wetter places are actually going to have more of a reservoir and they won't respond as quickly to drought. So you can have these different hypotheses. There's even one that's emerged in the last couple of years that's in the middle. So this is the question we tested in our ECOSTRESS grant. And so this is just jumping right to the results. We created a normalized drought sensitivity metric that shows this is effectively evapotranspiration response to drought. So it's negative everywhere. We should expect that after about a couple months of a dry anomaly, we should see some negative evapotranspiration responses. And we do see that. In some cases, there's a positive response, but that's in some of the wettest places. And we even zoomed in then with ECOSTRESS, and we looked at the United States and said, okay, what does ECOSTRESS evapotranspiration with very, much higher resolution data show about drought? And so you can see a lot more variations there spatially and say, okay, well, let's test the patterns. Do the wetter locations or the drier locations respond more to drought? So we started plotting that. And you plot that, and it turns out, okay, it seems like the driest ecosystems respond the most to drought. So we get some trend, but it's actually a lot of variability. So sometimes you don't even get statistically significant gradients. That the driest ecosystems tend to show on average more ET loss under drought. So it supports the resource limitation hypothesis I put up there. It supports that a bit more. And it turns out also that site level data shows that hypothesis also has more merit, that drier locations do respond more to drought. But it's not a very strong relationship. And I'm kind of putting this up there for effect and showing the correlation values. They're very low. And in some cases, depending on how you plot it, there's no correlation. So that you could argue that there might not be a gradient at all, that neither of these hypotheses are true. So what we also did in this grant was said, well, maybe we're doing the water limitation metric wrong. Why don't we plot something called the time spent in the water limited regime, which is effectively how much time we spend below moisture thresholds. It was a different metric we came up with, and it's plotted up there on the top left. We determined how much time a location spends water limited and said, okay, this might be a better metric than the mean amount of soil moisture in a year. Well, then we plotted that as well, and turned out we also didn't get a gradient. So that idea was effectively not necessarily a good one. It didn't illuminate anything. That again, mostly, there is some like more time spent in the water limited locations there. We do see a little bit more drought sensitivity there, so more negative values on the right, but not that much. Again, so this metric didn't really help us. So what's going on? We also sidestepped and took a look at some mechanisms and said, hey, what's going on? Should land atmosphere coupling, water use efficiency explain some of this variation? So we saw that, okay, drier environments do have stronger water limitation and land atmosphere coupling. So maybe that could have a bearing on drought sensitivity. And we did see in the bottom left there, more drought sensitive locations tend to have stronger land atmosphere coupling. So there might be kind of a propagation of dry conditions, dry atmosphere, dry moisture, it feeds back. So you get a more drought response. Again, not such a convincing, plot that this is definitely something that's going on. And also water use efficiency has a positive relationship, it seems, with mean moisture amounts. So drier locations, again, they have lower water use efficiency. So we'd expect from that drier environments having a lower water use efficiency, they should be more drought sensitive then. Again, there is some bearing on that. That might be true, but it's a lot of variability, and it's a very weak relationship. So what did we just saw this paper came out last year by a bunch of ecologists. They did these drought net studies. And I was looking to see, did they find anything about moisture gradients? So they did a bunch of these controlled experiments. They said, okay, let's reduce the amount of water in these ecosystems and see how do grasses and shrublands and trees and such respond. And they get the same thing. That top left up there, the mean annual precipitation and versus drought response there. Again, generally a small relationship, that lower moisture amounts, more drought sensitive in the drier locations, but there's a ton of spread. Look at all the spread. And then you try to describe, okay, species richness, biodiversity, aridity metrics, legacy effects, and the B up there. What's describing all this? There's so much spread. They were only able to get an R squared of about 0.15, basically, across all these metrics. And these are nice controlled field experiments. So they're seeing all this spread too, even at sites. So this wasn't a satellite issue that, oh, we're getting all the spread from the satellite data. So what we did then was we zoomed in. So the result we're working on right now is that with ECOSTRESS data, we can plot 70-meter resolution ET and actually zoom in and make a plot of 70-meter resolution drought sensitivity, which is in the top left up there. And we saw a ton of spread again. And we even plotted it versus the mean soil moisture gradient there and found that if you look across a mean gradient, you might see just as much variation across that mean gradient across the whole United States of drought sensitivity as you might in the same little area that you draw your box around. So basically, if you're in Maryland and you go over to Patuxent or what have you around here and try to measure drought sensitivity, you might see more variation walking around Maryland looking at drought sensitivity than just on average just going across the United States and seeing how it varies across the United States. That's how much spatial variability there is. In fact, the spatial variability, I think, obscures the moisture gradients. So there's so much spatial variability of drought sensitivity that we can't really answer this question too well of which locations respond more to drought. It's almost intractable is kind of what this top left plot says. There's some, on average, bearing that drier locations do respond more to drought, but there's a ton of variability. And you might say to me, oh, that's grass versus trees or crops. You're forgetting grasses versus trees and crops. Well, take Landsat, go grab Hansen's Landsat data and isolate only the trees and isolate only the short statured pixel, isolate only the crop pixels, and you get the same plot. So even within trees, even within grasses, even within crops, we see the same amount of spatial variability. So meaning that grasses in the Western US versus grasses in the Eastern US are all having this high variability of drought response as well. It's not that, oh, we're looking at trees versus grasses in some locations. It's actually an issue of trees versus grasses in a pixel. No, if you just isolate all of those different types of life forms, you get the same plot. Crops, short statured vegetation, that's grasses and shrublands, forests. You see the same huge amount of variability spatially. So essentially saying that this isn't an issue of vegetation types necessarily. We might even be seeing intraspecies variation of drought sensitivity. So what we did in the end was we quantified a variable called within landscape variability of drought. So we basically drew a 1 kilometer box. So basically take University of Maryland's campus, and then you look at all the ECOSTRESS pixels within that box. All around, you look at Essex building, you look at NOAA here, you look at, the hotel over on, just look around all the vegetation types and look at drought sensitivity across the campus. And you get a huge amount of variability across the campus. So local scale variability within landscape variability is very large. And the bottom left here, I'll point, there's these small plots on the bottom that we're there just to say, hey, there's data there to show it, but it's a little hard to describe. Read these sentences over here on the right. And the bottom right one I'll point you to, that within landscape variability is 20 to 50% of the drought sensitivity magnitude for that pixel. So that means that if I know the drought sensitivity magnitude around University of Maryland, that if I can't really use that to predict how much Essex, the vegetation on Essex campus is really how sensitive that is to drought. It's going to be very variable across the whole campus. That's what it's saying. Very, very variable. In fact, so variable that it's going to be very difficult to predict within pixel variability of drought sensitivity. And this plot, this is really the last data plot I'm showing here, that local scale variability. So if I do that quantification, if I have a high local scale variability in certain pixels, that will also drive large regional scale variability, meaning that this local scale variability of drought sensitivity, just looking across the University of Maryland, is probably a major reason why we cannot see a gradient across regions. That might be a major reason. This plot here is showing there's some connection of the local scale variability to regional scale variability of drought responses. So suggests that on average, drought sensitivity for a given landscape has little representation for landscapes and regions around it. This is effectively what it's saying. It's a very unpredictable process, meaning that the folks, our friends, our field ecologist friends, our ecophysiologist friends that are out there measuring individual plants, we have to almost rely on them more than the satellite folks because we have no idea how to scale this up. This is kind of what this result is saying. So going back to the original answer here, I don't have as good of a nice clean answer as the first question. This one, which land surfaces respond the most to drought? Okay, there's a weak gradient. Drought in Arizona might have more bearing on vegetation there, but there's so much variability across field scale studies, across satellites, the satellite pixels, that I'm not sure that this is a very predictable process. But at the least, we can say that this is a very variable process and one that's unpredictable and probably one that's causing an error term whenever you're trying to run a model, doing looking at your trendy model, your dynamic vegetation model and getting an output and you have a drought. That might be an error term that's pretty substantial because this isn't a very predictable process. So coming back to the main, the kind of this picture again that I really like, this counter argument that okay, we have some idea of how much mean annual precipitation affects vegetation functioning. I think we've given some idea that this daily rainfall variability metric should be in the equation and should be in the equation for evaporation. It should be in the equation for vegetation functioning, probably for groundwater, probably for runoff. Daily rainfall variability matters. Subseasonal drought, I don't know that we've really quantified the sensitivities very well. We have a very pixelated mess. But what it at least says is that if I'm in a wet place, I might have either a very large drought sensitivity or I might have none at all. So it just says that this variable here is also an error term that we have to think about. Why am I doing all of this? I think this last bullet point is very important. So critical to capture these relationships with observations to benchmark model responses. So a lot of folks use models to predict the carbon cycle, the water cycle. And we use pretty simple functions with amount of soil moisture, amount of light. And it turns out that we have to do a better job with these on the right if we're going to increase our predictability of the Earth system. So that's the general response there. Are there other forms of rainfall variability? Is there others, a 20-day variability that we're not thinking about? Sure. There's probably, you're thinking about Madden-Julian oscillation and 20-day variability like that. That'll definitely come up. We haven't necessarily investigated that, but point is that there's sources of variability on the right side of this equation that are being lumped into your error term for whatever work you're doing, trying to predict vegetation or ET functioning. So future work, just throwing out there that this is still a work in process. In fact, we have a new grant that is trying to break down that daily rainfall variability problem and saying, okay, let's make sure that we know after it rains how each of these variables actually evolves in time after it rains, because this is important apparently that we need to know daily rainfall variability. So let's observe all of these and then do models capture this behavior. So do models actually capture what we observe from satellites and field studies? And I think for the bottom one there, we're still working on our NASA ECOSTRESS project. We're publishing the papers, but I think taking a deep look at the mechanisms of what's driving drought sensitivity spatial variations is a hugely important topic. I think spatial scale is a big one there. So that's it. I'll end there. Yeah.
Questions? We have a couple online ones, so I think we'll take turns, but does someone in person want to start us off? Okay.
Really interesting seminar here. A question, you talked about the scale of things, like in the vegetation. It sounded like you got down to a very fine spatial scale, like 1 kilometer, correct?
Yes, and then 70, the last few slides you're looking at were 70-meter scale. Yeah.
But you didn't really get down to that fine a scale on precipitation. What's your spatial scale on your rainfall?
The spatial scale. Okay, so there's two different answers for that. For the two different projects, the first project we looked at, we were using soil moisture to, we used precipitation for that, and that was a 1 degree, half degree resolution scale project. The second one we used soil moisture, satellite soil moisture, which is 9-kilometer gridded scale, to show where there's a drought, a dry anomaly. Assuming to some degree that it's very challenging to get anything higher resolution than that, I would say, even from reanalysis. We're assuming that drought's actually pretty autocorrelated, and it is. If you have a drought in this part of Maryland, you're going to have a fairly dry conditions up the highway a little bit. It's pretty autocorrelated.
Yeah, my question is sort of on the spatial scale, rainfall is very highly variable, even below a half a degree.
Yep.
And I would think that would, even the spatial scale of daily rainfall could affect your results and might be related to some of the things you're not able to derive. And even the daily scale, there's a difference between hourly data and daily data. And that kind of variability has all kinds of things related to runoff and lots of other things. And you do have satellite precipitation data at fairly fine spatial scales these days with iMerge.
That's what was used in the first study, by the way. Yeah, this was iMerge.
Oh, you're using iMerge?
I'm using iMerge. Yeah,
That should take, but you're not going down. So you're going down to that resolution?
iMerge is at 0.1, or is it 0.0? Yeah.
10 kilometers. Okay.
Yep.
Well, then that's pretty good. I'll remove my comments maybe.
No, but okay, but
I think it's interesting, but the variability on precipitation might be as large or larger than the variability on the vegetation end of things.
Yep. You are correct. You don't have to back down from that comment. You're actually correct, because the spatial scale, when you're looking at daily metrics, and I think you were making this point, if you add spatial scale, you'll reduce the intensity. So if you go up in spatial scale, if you aggregate iMerge to 1 degree from 0.1 degrees, the storms get smaller just because you're averaging, because it's so highly concentrated. We're hoping that the 9-kilometer doesn't mess, or sorry, 10-kilometer-ish doesn't mess with this too much. That's the hope.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to shift to an online question and we'll come back to in person. Since these types of responses may be physiologically driven by differences or changes in root versus shoot carbon allocation, as well as other below ground soil processes, what are the challenges of evaluating vegetation functioning by above ground biomass / LAI alone? Are there any clever ways of addressing those challenges when using remote sensing data?
That's a good question. We can't look at below ground. I mean, the below ground processes are, they're not, I wouldn't say they're unobservable, but it's derived. I'd say it's definitely a derived product that you would use. I think one whole study, and actually it was pretty much my whole PhD thesis that I didn't show here, was we used microwave vegetation, so vegetation water content, to look at pulse responses, basically look at daily scale variations in vegetation functions. So we actually see kind of rehydration, kind of plant hydraulic processes at short time scales for some of the short time scale, sub-weekly behavior. But when it comes to root versus shoot behavior, which is absolutely a factor, we're not able to really kind of observe it at the scale that's appropriate and even give you an answer that's satisfying to that. But I have thought about that a lot. I would like to observe that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm a gardener, and so I'm thinking about, I'm told that you're supposed to water, like in the summer, you're supposed to water the plants early in the morning and not around noon or 1 o'clock. Of course, I always do it at the wrong time because I forget. But that is a case where you have the same daily variability and the same amount of water. It's just the time of day.
Yep.
So I'm wondering if that's been considered. And then also as a gardener, I know that locations where there's clay and rocks, like the NASA garden, apparently, I didn't know this, but they put the garden on was a place where Metro had dumped all of its building materials when they were making doing the setup in the 70s. And it's really hard to grow plants there. And then when I go home to University Park, I have nice soil and I get so I'm wondering whether soil, like amount of clay, variability of clay, and I'm told that is highly spatially variable. So how does that play in? So
yeah, these are both highly excellent. By the way, all these questions have been very good. So this question is excellent because we did not consider in this regression one of the things we didn't consider was the concentration of rainfall. If you have it all concentrated in a month versus spread out over multiple months too. That's one term we did not put in that regression that might have mattered a bit. And some field studies have shown that mattered. Time of day, we neglected because we used daily rainfall. So we didn't know, but you're right. Rehydration mostly happens overnight. And then you have a midday depression. So if you water your plants, during the afternoon, you're mostly helping cool them, but maybe not as much helping with rehydration as effectively as doing it at night. So that's absolutely something we neglected. I think we pick up on a lot just from the daily scale. And if we start adding terms, we start having we start having we start adding too many terms to the equation that might actually you start running into econometrics problems of mixing the error terms basically between two different variables and actually forcing them to have higher errors. It's called multicollinearity. So that's one reason we didn't add more variables. But I think you're right. That's going to be a factor. The second question as well about soil texture. My answer to that, I've been asked this many times, and my answer to that is I don't know how good of soil texture data we actually have. Because when I run regressions of, okay, I have an output, a spatial output, and now I have this sand fraction or clay fraction from USGS, and I correlate them, I don't get a very good correlation. I should because of the inverse texture hypothesis is one of the things, kind of getting technical, that clay is going to do a lot better with kind of drizzle events. So it's going to prevent infiltration, whereas sandy kind of, coarser silt soil is going to do better with more intense rainfall regimes because you get more infiltration. So we should see it because of that technically. So I don't know if it's a scale issue or we don't have that good of data, but we should see it. Yeah. If you're a gardener and you go from one side of your garden to the other, I'm sure you're going to see different stratification. I don't know if it's possible to reliably capture sand and such fraction and stuff and the vertical distribution from kind of a grid scale. I think it's very challenging to do, and hopefully not offending anybody that does that work. It's hard work, but I don't know that we have a good map that can actually do what you're asking there. Yeah. That's a good question. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, I have a couple more. Because precipitation is long-tailed, years with higher means will tend to have higher variance. Has this effect been accounted for somehow, or is this correlation a concern in interpreting the results?
That's a good question. I think we're looking at one of the ways we're normalizing that issue out is we're using wet day frequency. So you end up converting that variable into a kind of a discretized variable of how many times it rained. So you actually remove a little bit of the variance issue of precipitation in some contexts. But it's a good point. It also actually matters a lot for the soil moisture side of things because you get kind of a bounded variable issue where you go to low soil moisture values and then you bound soil moisture to actually identify droughts and determine drought sensitivities. So I've actually had more of an issue with that problem I'm going to go back to this plot here of looking at drought sensitivities. These are normalized. I'm trying to normalize this by soil moisture variance. And I'm really worried about that for soil moisture variance because you have a bounded variable issue with drier locations having a lower soil moisture variance by default. So I think it's a great question. I think we normalize that out properly in our precipitation side of the study, the daily rainfall variability. I think we normalize it out somewhat. Here, I'm still thinking about that. I've talked to my statistician friends and they think it's okay how we've done this here, but I worry about that still. So that's a good question. I've thought about it.
In-person questions?
So you might have covered this, but did you see a difference between your SIF remote sensing data and NDVI in terms of this subseasonal drought response?
So we didn't use it. So we use only the NDVI for the drought side of things. For the daily rainfall variability one, we use the SIF and NDVI. Answering in that context, no. We saw very similar responses between SIF and NDVI. I go to the SIF sessions each year at AGU, and it seems like it's a challenge figuring out why at the field scale SIF is so different from the actual SIF you measure in the field, the actual emission of kind of photosynthetic behavior versus the satellite scale that starts to look like NDVI at times. We kind of saw what NDVI was doing from SIF, the satellite SIF. And I think there's an issue there with scale or something with instrumentation that I think satellite SIF starts to look a little bit like NDVI. And we saw that here. And I don't know. I'm not a SIF person enough to know why that is.
I am also not a SIF person. But I will say that I think as a field ecologist, I think there's always winners and losers in drought. And I would not be surprised if you were able to dig into individual trees and like individual plant clades that you would see that explaining a lot of your variability.
That's a good point too, because I think folks see SIF changing behavior under drought, like even the satellite scale. The point is, I think SIF should be more sensitive, or at least pick up on the drought sensitivity more than NDVI should. I think that's at least a hypothesis, and I think some folks have shown that. So I'm going to try that. I only used the NDVI. We were mostly looking at EDT for that one, for that study. That's a good point. I haven't thought of that. Thank you. Yeah.
I think this will be our last question, just because we're at the hour, but go ahead. No, you.
Thank you. I really like your definition of the question, and it gave me some insights to understand how the precipitation influence the vegetation function and then influence the fire regime like those. I hope to understand how you define the temporal scale of the daily rainfall variability. Did you directly calculate that variability in the whole year?
It's a very good question. So there's different ways you can do that. I'll go back to this slide here. So the second bullet point there, we calculated. So if you look at this regression here, so we have an array on the left of 20 NDVI values over 2 decades, for instance, or 30, depends on what variable you're using. And then you have an array of, for annual amount of precipitation, 500 millimeters, 520, 400. But then for the daily rainfall, we calculated the amount of wet days as one of the variables. How many days in that year were over 1 millimeter of rainfall? You can do 0.5 millimeters. So then you have a value like 200 or 170. So that's one variable. And then the other variable, we looked at 2 other variables, how long the dry spells were, 7-day average over a year, or 8-day average or 4-day average, or Intensity was another one we looked at. On average, when it rained on those wet days, how intense was the average rainfall event in that year? So there's a couple different metrics used as the answer. And we looked at across the whole year and also just the seasonal as well, just within the rainy season to calculate those as well. I don't know if that answers your question, but we looked at several metrics as the answer.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I can look into more details in the paper. And I have another question similar to a previous online question. I wondered, except NDVI, did you ever consider LAI as a vegetation to consider the vertical accumulation?
Yeah, we did look at it here. I think it's almost the same as NDVI because I think it's often scaled by and NDVI ends up being scaled as a derived product, or at least the bands are scaled into LAI and using an algorithm like an empirical function. So we end up getting very similar answers with LAI
Okay.
compared to just because they're similar. There are similar things used to derive them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great to know.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Andrew, do you have your email on any of these slides?
Oh my goodness, I don't. Sorry, it's just my name at nasa.gov or yeah, so it's andrew.feldman@nasa.gov. And then my UMD email, which I also check daily and hourly, is afeld, AFELD 24@umd.edu.
Okay, perfect. There's a couple of online questions that are lingering, but we are going to have to close out. I also know everybody here, so I can just connect you guys off.
Send an email. That's fine. I'll answer. Yeah.
You guys.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for attending.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for attending. Appreciate it.
Of course, thank you to Andrew. Our seminar series, we have one more lesson in the semester, and that's next Monday, or sorry, this Monday, 1 week from today. Thank you, everybody. Have a good afternoon.
Yeah, thanks.
Good job.
Thank you. Enjoyed it. Appreciate it.